Julio Gimenez, who's talking about the role of disciplinary epistemologies. Well, anyway, he can introduce it. You all know him, I'm sure. He's a very distinguished colleague, and we'll look forward to hearing his views. And please feel free to join me in eating a sandwich, but not my sandwich.
Thank you, Joe. Hello, and thank you very much for coming to the seminar. Whether you are here personally, or in person, or virtually, I don't know if we have anyone joining us from cyberspace. But
nobody has yet confessed to it.
Okay, we'll get there. Right, as John said, I'm Julio Gimenez, and I'm a lecturer of English language and academic literacies at the Centre of English Language Education, and also part of HAV. In my presentation today, I would like to talk a little bit about my recent work that looks at disciplinary epistemologies, or the links between disciplinary epistemologies and academic writing in higher education. And I know this might sound like a very ambitious plan for 1 hour, but let me start with some background to my work, so that I hope this will contextualize the presentation and at the same time give you a better idea of where I'm coming from. As most of my work, the ideas and data for papers I've written on the topic and this presentation have come from my teaching practices. So by reflecting on what I do, I sort of discover ideas, or like in this case, was not very happy. I'm sorry, it seems to be small. Can you read it? Yeah, it all started with a dissatisfaction with my approach to writing, to teaching academic writing, and also researching academic writing, which was a bit generic, if you like. And not that I'm against generic stuff, but I was starting to wonder whether this was enough to help students, you know, be part of their disciplinary communities. And since I moved to the UK from Argentina, I have started developing this dissatisfaction with teaching generic academic writing, especially because I started teaching within academic writing within the disciplines, and realized that actually there are certain generic principles that would not help students much when they transfer from what we do into their schools. At the same time, I started reflecting whether I was providing students with opportunities to really engage with their disciplinary practices, and how their discipline structure academic writing, not only in terms of the formal structure, you know, introduction, body and conclusion, but also how different disciplines conceptualize and communicate disciplinary knowledge. One example could be history, for example. Students doing history degrees are normally discouraged from writing lengthy introductions, you know, the typical introduction with the background and then the rationale and the reason for the essay, for example. And they are usually told to examine evidence and the ideologies involved in a situation or historical event as early as possible in their writing. And the opposite is true for health sciences, for example. So I started to see that there were some conflicting, you know, tendencies in my practice and what students needed to do. So at the same time, I realized that concepts like criticality, voice, and evidence are not generic, in the sense that we cannot teach to be critical and then that will apply to whatever discipline students are doing, or the program they're doing. So they're rather discipline specific. And so I decided to look more closely at how different disciplines, and especially the ones I was working in, conceptualize and communicate disciplinary knowledge, especially in writing. So far I've been doing midwifery, nursing, business and engineering. As I say, my trajectory started with delivering babies, and now I'm looking at fixing engines. So that's basically my trajectory as an academic writing lecturer. And also looking at the work by other colleagues, and I suppose that's the big near and far from the title of my talk. So looking at the work that my colleagues, for example, at home in Argentina, Yana Martinez, is looking more or less at the same line of work, but in biology and agricultural sciences. And Anna Jones, for example, in Australia, is doing practically a similar kind of approach in medicine and history. And then Inmaculada Fortane Gomez in Spain is working in business studies. So basically that's a bit the background to the talk and my work. If you allow me to go back in time, when I started to feel dissatisfied with my own practices, I used to think, well, academic writing is a generic skill which can be taught, and once learned can be transferred from context to context. And probably my idea, and some other people also have the same idea, of being able to transfer writing, academic writing, from context to context, springs from the confusion between writing and academic writing. I tend to think, like many other people, that academic writing is a specific type of writing. Yes, it's true, students need to know to write, and that is what they may transfer. But academic writing is more discipline specific, and therefore might not be transferable, or as transferable as we would like to believe. At the same time, the other belief is that attributes of academic writing, such as criticality, voice, and evidentiality, are also generic and transferable. So we can teach students to be critical in generic terms, and then they can become critical when writing, their discipline-specific texts. And also the traditional essay is the key writing genre, or academic genre, if you like, that all students need to learn at university. And then I discovered that there are disciplines that do not write essays, for example, but they write other genres. So this created what Teresa Lillis calls the East culture in higher education. So these were kind of looking back on my practice and reflecting on my practice. These are the, say, if you like, the tenets of my writing practices, and those are the things that sort of made me feel rather uncomfortable about what I was doing. So I discovered, as I said, like, for example, if you take criticality, in engineering, for example, criticality is conceived as of a skill for creative problem solving, or to make sound decisions. But if you look at, for example, midwifery, criticality, they have a different take on criticality, and criticality is used to explain the links between theory and practice, and to be able to understand ideology and social change that influence and are connected to midwifery practice. And in business studies, for example, criticality is a skill for conceptual problem solving, and also for making logical evaluations. So even if these are very general terms, when you have a cursory view of what a term like criticality means in different disciplines, you can see that there are important differences that students need to know. Or if we take authoria presens, for example, as academic writers, nurses prefer authoria, what I call authorial absence. So they want to be, absent from their text, even when they are writing reflexively. So they are talking about their reflection, their reflective practice. Sorry, they are writing reflexively on their practice, and they are sort of referring to themselves as the student nurse in the third person. But midwives, for example, and midwifery has been for a long time associated with nursing, believing that nursing and midwifery are two similar disciplines. But midwives, as academic writers, choose to be present, especially when they are writing reflectively. And engineers would write in personal accounts of experiments, but personal evaluations of projects. So there is a contextual element there to be taken into account, not only context in terms of what genre they're writing, but also a disciplinary context. So I started questioning, reflecting, and researching, questioning my own pedagogical practices for teaching academic writing within the disciplines, and also reflecting upon whether my class was space for students to have an opportunity to, explore how academic writing was actually constructed within their own disciplines, and also starting to research how the disciplines, especially those I was working on, conceptualize how they conceptualize and communicate disciplinary knowledge, especially in writing. So, what did I want to do this for? First, I wanted to understand how criticality, voice, and evidentiality are or not epistemologically conceptualized in a number of disciplines, the ones that I was working on, and also to see whether these conceptualizations have a direct link with academic writing, and if academic writing was generic or was being shaped by the way different disciplines conceptualize these attributes. And when I say academic practices, I have a focus on writing, but I think this also happens when students are asked to read and also present, in their disciplines. And this is more evident at undergraduate level, because postgraduate level students have already gone through at least 3 years of being in contact and working with their disciplinary texts. So some of the literature that inform my work are familiar with Beecher's work and the idea of disciplines and epistemologies. The other part of the literature that has informed my work is discursive representation of knowledge. That is to say, how different disciplines write about knowledge and how they communicate knowledge in writing. Generic attributes, whether we think criticality is something that we can teach once and for all, and basically the work, as I said before, by Anna Jones in Australia. And then discipline-specific writing, whether we need to sort of, make a case for writing to be discipline-specific rather than generic. Some findings, and I'm going to go over this very quickly. I know you are familiar with this. Beecher's work was the first sort of large-scale project to look at key features of knowledge base, and he said, well, if we can talk about two big groups of disciplines, we can say science-based disciplines and the humanities, and how they differ in their relationship with knowledge. And so he said, in general terms, knowledge for the science-based disciplines is a concrete, impersonal, and value-free entity, and that's how these disciplines relate with knowledge, or tend to see knowledge. And there is an emphasis on material objects and information report. Whereas if we look at the humanities in general, knowledge is a more abstract and open to individual interpretation entity, and with a greater emphasis on argumentation rather than, material objects. There is a third position, if you like, where we see knowledge as critical to the development of competence and as having a potential to generate action in practice. So we can see that it's more practice-based, or towards practice, knowledge used at the service of practice, if you like, and with a strong emphasis on problem solving. So if we look at the 4 disciplines I was talking about before, we can then place them on a continuum rather than, I'm not trying to say, well, there is a dichotomous relationship between disciplines, but we can place different disciplines along this knowledge continuum, if you like. So nursing, we can see nursing that moves towards the science-based disciplines, where midwifery, for example, more towards the humanities. I'm not saying that midwifery is part of the humanities, they would not accept that. But, if you look at their relationship with knowledge, it moves the discipline towards that end of the continuum, whereas we have engineering and probably business more towards the practical end of knowledge. Of course, this is just an exercise, because Beecher said, well, putting disciplines together and looking at boundaries and establishing boundaries between disciplines is not really what matters. But there are other issues that actually, and if you look at the history of certain disciplines like nursing, you can see that their relationship with knowledge has been changing throughout time. So normally disciplines tend to have this fluid relationship with knowledge and discursive construction of knowledge. So as Beecher says, well, it's one thing is to talk about the territory, and a completely different thing is to talk about boundaries. So boundaries are not fixed, but rather fluid. In terms of discursive representations, they say how different disciplines actually write or talk about their relationship with knowledge. We see Parry's work, and he says, well, it's interesting to look at how writers discursively assert knowledge. This is what is worth knowing in our discipline. So it's not only how they construct knowledge, but also what they think is worth knowing. Different disciplines would say, well, this is worth knowing, this is not. And also the conventions that different disciplines follow to structure the discourse they use to talk about and communicate knowledge. So again, going back to the continuum, we can look at the discourse continuum that goes from science-based disciplines and to the humanities. And on that end, the science-based end, we can see that knowledge is discursively constructed and communicated by a process of accumulation, especially facts, and it is following a set of, I don't want to say strict rules, a set of strict rules, but it's stricter than the humanities, for example. And the humanity, we have that knowledge is discursively constructed in a more interpretative way, and arguments are constructed in a more holistic manner. So that means that there is more room for argumentation and arguing about different positions, whereas in discipline-based disciplines there are more rules to follow. And also, looking at the third position, we would say that knowledge can be discursively constructed and communicated by a process of description and analysis. So if you think of, for example, sciences like engineering, they would elicit, structure and formalize knowledge to be able to solve a problem or to create a project to solve an existing problem. And so they follow established patterns like the problem solution pattern, which is very common in engineering writing. They have a problem, they have a project, which means solving that problem. Okay. I'm not saying that that's the only discipline that follows this pattern. This pattern is very common, even in commercials. If you look at commercials that present the problem and then the solution, like saying, well, have you ever thought about the germs in your kitchen? And say, don't worry, we have the solution here. So it's again the same type of pattern, but some disciplines use that pattern much more than others. So I'm not going to sort of bore you with all the details, but if we look at the models of knowledge and knowledge creation that some of these disciplines follow, we see that nursing follows the positivist model, where knowledge is mainly empirical, and therefore that marks the relationship that they create between knowledge and criticality, evidentiality and voice. So it marks a very strong starting point. Knowledge is empirically created. Whereas engineering, knowledge is used to develop competence, for example, and the potential to generate action in practice because they have a problem that they need to solve. and they use knowledge that has been created within the discipline to solve this problem. So, for nursing, for example, criticality is used to explain the relationship between health and illness, for example, and to reflect upon practice. Whereas, oops, sorry. Oh, what have I done? Nice. Well, that's the end of the presentation. There we are. Sorry about that. That happens when you're using two things at the same time. So, going back to how engineering relates with criticality, they see it as a way of creating or producing creative, problem solving strategies, and also making sound decisions. In terms of evidentiality, what they consider good evidence, because of the positivist model that nursing follows, there is a hierarchy of evidence that runs from randomized control trials at the top. That is to say, that is the most scientific evidence that you can get in nursing. And that's the preferred form, if you like, of evidence in nursing, to expert opinion at the bottom of the scale. So asking, experts for their opinion about an issue is not as strong as coming up with evidence from controlled trials, randomized controlled trials. And if we look at engineering, for example, yes, evidence is scientific, but it's a more complex entity because professional experience is also accepted and needed and required in some contexts. And that also determines how in nursing they relate with voice. Writing is to be objective and impersonal in most circumstances, even, as I said before, when they are writing reflectively. Whereas in engineering, it's mostly impersonal, but there is also a room for personal writing, especially when they are evaluating, for example, the feasibility of a project, for example. If we look at midwifery, that follows a constructivist model, that will determine also how they relate with knowledge and attributes for academic writing. So it's basically that their knowledge base is scientific, but there's also room for competence and intuition and personal and what they call embodied knowledge, which is basically knowledge that you develop from practice. Remember that in nursing, expert opinion was considered sort of the last type of evidence that is sort of regarded as good for academic writing or creating knowledge, whereas midwifery, they are more flexible in terms of embodied knowledge and expert opinion. In terms of how they relate with criticality, they use to be critical in midwifery is to be able to explain the links between theory and practice more than health and illness, as what nursing was, and to understand the ideology and social changes that are connected with midwifery care. Evidentiality, again, so if you look at evidentiality in nursing and midwifery is more a holistic entity. It is scientific, but it's also objective and based on empirical facts. But it's also based on clinical experience and embodied knowledge. And although they are mostly impersonal when they write, it's all relative to what is being explained or what is being written. And personal descriptions and reflections are also important. Midwives have a sort of a long tradition of writing what they call reflexive care, or it's a piece of writing where the students observe a midwife in practice, and then they have to write a reflective care. That is to say, they have to reflect on the care they have seen. And there is a lot of evaluating what they have observed and personal involvement in their writing. If we look at business, for example, and business studies in general, that followed a more applied model to knowledge, we see that knowledge is used to develop competence, and it's also the basis for skills development. And then criticality is, again, as I said before, is kind of a skills to talk about conceptual problem solving and to make logical evaluations. Whereas evidentiality shows a more balanced mix of scientific evidence and professional practice. And in terms of voice, it's mostly impersonal, but personal evaluations are also important. All this is very general sort of bird's eye view, if you like, of how these four different disciplines relate with knowledge, and how they look at and how their relationship with knowledge will determine how they see criticality, evidentiality, and voice. So, if we look at, for example, some conceptualizations of criticality, we can look at something very generic, like, for example, criticality as generic skill. This Stella Cottrell's book is a very famous book in higher education, and talks about critical thinking, and is used in many courses that where they teach students to be critical. And so she approaches critical thinking as a cognitive activity. But if you look at the key concepts in her definition, she has the rather generic approach. I'm not saying that I'm not criticising Stella Cottrell. I'm just saying that is one way, and the way I used to follow, to do critical thinking and academic writing. But then if we look at, for example, criticality in the disciplines, and this is taken from the QAA benchmark statements, in this case for social policy and administration and social work, we see that criticality is more rooted, if you like, in the discipline. So it's not as generic as the first conceptualization of criticality. And they talk about action, reflection, and context, which is very important in the disciplines. And also, if we look at general business and management studies, for example, they talk about being aware and sensitive to the diversity in terms of people, culture, business, and management issues. So it's not as generic as it is presented in some of the literature. So we can talk of a climb and move from generic approaches to criticality to discipline-specific approaches. And the same happens with voice and individuality. One must have an individual voice. And I always have problems with these ideas. I think they're great, but then how do I translate those ideas into pedagogical practice and help students to develop their individual voice? Or responsibility, like, using the first person singular to be responsible for what you're saying as a writer, and not withdrawing responsibility, as Rosie Banning said. And also identity, creating students' identity as writers. But if you look at, for example, voice in the disciplines, again in nursing, this is from my own research, a nursing lecturer telling me, well, in nursing, students are required to project an impersonal voice and avoid using the first person singular. So we see the clash, and I always think of my students telling, yeah, you have to develop your own voice and use I to become responsible, a responsible writer, etc., etc., and then going into nursing and saying, no, you can't do that. You have to be irresponsible here. So again, we have like this move from generic to discipline specific, and the same happens with evidentiality, that some of the arguments in the literature are very generic, whereas if you look at, for example, evidentiality in the disciplines, like in this case midwifery, it's, as I said before, a very complex and very complex notion, and encompasses not only scientific evidence, but also expert knowledge and evaluation of previous policies and midwifery practice. So again, the same thing. So I started thinking, okay, what do I do? Is it generic and transferable? Is it discipline specific? It's very difficult to come by a definition of what we mean by transferable skills, especially in relation to writing. And I got this from the skills portal for Oxford University researchers. I'm afraid, I don't know why I was lucky to come across that. Now it's not available anymore. But it was widely available there. They have the URL, but I've tried many times and couldn't get back to that. But they defined transferable skills as the ability learned in one context which can be applied in another. And I suppose that after the Dearman report, that sort of created this idea of transferable skills in higher education. This was more or less the idea behind that movement. But Anna Jones, for example, says, well, the transferable skills argument ignores the importance of the disciplinary culture and community of practice, and that's kind of where I'm coming from. And yes, some generic skills may be important, but are they enough? And what would be the most helpful way to help students? So some thoughts. Then I decided, well, academic writing is actually, from my point of view then, largely discipline specific, criticality, voice and evidentiality, and all the other central attributes of academic writing are quite central, and we probably don't spend too much time or enough time talking about that and developing those skills or generic attributes in students' writing. And these attributes are not generic and transferable, but discipline specific, and probably more importantly, epistemologically determined. As I said before, I mean, different disciplines can have a different take on these different attributes. And how they conceptualize attributes poses challenges for undergraduate student writers. We used to think that students didn't move outside their discipline, and they did a degree in business and they took all the modules, but that is not happening anymore. Students are moving and taking electives from other schools, and doing part of research with Julio, one of my colleagues. We were talking with engineering students, and they say two of them were very good engineering students, had very high marks in their assignments, but they decided to take 2 modules outside their disciplines, and they did 2 modules from business studies, and they weren't that successful because they couldn't understand how business determined or conceptualized criticality. And we looked at their writing in both, for both occasions, and they say, this is critical. For me as an engineering student, this is critical. But if you look at the feedback I got not critical enough. So I think there are important issues to take into account when we decide, to go to be very generic. Am I doing the talk?
You're fine. Well, it depends how much more you've got to say.
Don't know. Let's see. and so looking at my own teaching practice, I thought, well, current approaches to teaching academic writing may not be adequate, helping students with a transition from, if you like, pre-sessional courses and discipline-specific work. And I'm becoming more and more interested in the, transitions. Transitions, I've discovered, maybe it's not a new idea, but transitions are usually the time that falls through the cracks. We are very interested in when students start university, then when students start their degree, when students graduate, when they go into the labour market. But there are these transitions from, for example, pre-sessional to schools, and the links between you know, generic and discipline-specific work that I think we are not paying too much attention to. So what I wanted to do is to create maybe another ambitious plan to create an alternative pedagogy, whereas you know, intervention that could encourage students to examine the relationship between disciplinary epistemologies, attributes, and academic practices, especially academic writing in higher education. And I keep insisting on this because I feel, talking to my colleagues from different departments, they don't feel this is their responsibility and say, no, this is not my job, this is somebody else's job. And somebody else's to me means the academic writing lecturer. But I talk to my colleagues and say, no, I can't teach this because they are very discipline specific. So it seems to me that some of these attributes are not being taught or discussed by anyone, and students are sort of left to learn the hard way, kind of trial and error, until they get their writing right. Pedagogical intervention so far, and this is based on, you know, some of my work and also some of my colleagues' work. Two ideas are student writers of researchers of academic practices in their own disciplines. This is not new. I mean, we have been, especially in academic writing, we've been talking for a long time about students becoming researchers of their own disciplines. But I haven't seen much done in terms of academic writing and you know, pedagogical intervention. Sometimes there are very good ideas and the theory is very good, but the transfer from theory to practice is not always happening. And the other idea is student writers as analysts. So first researchers and then analysing what results they've got. So let me give you more specific details about it. The first one is knowledge, and I don't know, I have the impression from talking to students and my colleagues from the departments that we are not talking about what knowledge is and how it is conceptualized in the discipline, what is to, you know, how we construct knowledge, but also how, as I said before, how we think of knowledge as something worth having, how it is framed, and how it is linguistically realized. Also, attributes like criticality, voice, and evidentiality, how they are conceptualized and determined. What is to be critical in engineering? Is it the same as to be critical in applied linguistics, for example? Which I'm sure it's not. And how these are linguistically realized in terms of the actual language that students are expected to use to show that they really engage with knowledge, the way the discipline engages with knowledge. And then looking at the discourses and practices of the discipline, how knowledge and attributes are discursively represented in academic practices, and in this case in writing. I've realised that actually teaching, you know, I know this is an extreme example, but a typical 5-paragraph essay where you have an introduction, a body, 3 body paragraphs and a conclusion is not helping anyone, because actually when they move into their own departments, they realise that you know, they are less worried or concerned about the structure and more about how knowledge is constructed. Even if it isn't showing they know, probably, you know, when students start their degrees, they're not expected to construct knowledge, but to show that actually display that they are developing that knowledge. And even knowledge display has a certain structure and follows certain conventions, linguistic conventions and structural conventions. Once they have discovered all that, and one of the problems with being too discipline specific is what you do when you have a group of 30 students all belonging to different disciplines. So again, Yes, I know. The answer is, okay, teach them how to write a 5-paragraph essay. And we tend to fall back on generic teaching because that we think will apply to everyone. But if we sort of ask students to become researchers of their own disciplines, or the disciplines they're going to go to once they finish our generic academic writing course, then they could become more discipline specific in their research, in their understanding of academic writing, and also share with other students and start comparing and contrasting how different disciplines work. And once they have discovered all that, the following step is to start working on what I call disciplinary analysis. That is to say, how practices are epistemologically shaped. I remember the first time I presented at a conference in Europe, I just read my paper because I thought, well, that's what people do. And then everybody criticised me for reading my paper because I was not supposed to read my paper. And some people were saying, well, but his English is good enough not to need to read his paper. And there was a whole debate going on together with the debate at the conference, talking about my reading a paper rather than presenting like today from my notes or from the PowerPoint slides. And I wasn't central to that discipline, central enough to know that people in that discipline expected to be able to speak like I'm doing today. I think the same applies to reading, what you do with your readings, and reading is one of the skills we are not paying a lot of attention to. It's funny, in applied linguistics we tend to go from one skills to the next and tend to forget about the rest. And for a long time we've been looking at reading, then we've forgotten now. It seems that writing is the most important skill, but we seem to forget that they both go hand in hand. So how is reading assumed or expected to happen in the discipline, and also writing and also speaking? Again, presentations, although we teach presentations as generic skill, they are discipline specific. Different disciplines expect to have, to follow different conventions for presenting. And then discourse analysis, how practices are discursively represented in the discipline, not only in terms of the structure, but also the language that they use. Even the sentences, if you want to become very linguistic oriented, the sentences and how sentences are combined and structured in a piece of text. And also genre analysis, just being more specific about, okay, if you have to write a business report, how knowledge and attribute that constitute the academic practices of business discipline are linguistically realised in writing. So the different moves, and the report starts with an introduction. Do they have an introduction? Well, no, actually they don't. They have a business summary. And what are the different parts or sections of the executive summary that students need to learn to write or present? Yeah. I think that if students, and we see our role as helping students become participants and effective participants in their disciplinary practice, and therefore core participants in their discursive construction of knowledge, academic writing, and together with academic writing, disciplinary attributes should be explicitly taught, rather than, no, I can't do that because it's not my job. No, that's not my job. Somebody else has to do it. And this should become, a shared responsibility between content lecturers and writing lecturers alike. I think that's the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Julio. That's been awesome. Discussion. Open. Who's kicking off? Yes.
Yes, Dr. Julio. I have one point to make and one question. The first point is about criticality. In my own experience, criticality comes with confidence. So when I first came as a first-year student, I was not critical at all because I don't know what to criticize. So I think it is very important for lecturers to recognize that students are having sort of transition, like you say, in the first year. So that's not only to undergraduate but also to postgraduates especially. And secondly, my question is, so if we are supposed to learn how to become critical, is there any special guideline, formulaic phrases that we can use when we do, when we write, especially for second language learners like myself? Because I think that's the most difficult part, doing critical writing at the moment now.
Yeah. I do agree with what you were saying as part of your comment. I think there is also, a cultural dimension to criticality that we need to look at. I mean, there are some cultures that actually, in which students are not supposed to be critical, and that is something that we as lecturers need to recognise. And there is this debate about acculturating students to this culture, and what do we do? One thing I think is to make students become critical, even if that goes against their culture, because I've seen it happening all the time. No, you have to become critical. And a completely different thing is to help students produce a critical piece of writing. It's like playing the games, but without actually demanding them to become, critical thinkers, if that goes against themselves or their identity. So yes, it's a complex thing. I don't know, we've for a long time, going back to your question, we've been thinking of set phrases to mark criticality or to mark argument, and I think there are more, criticality is constructed in more nuanced ways than saying, okay, I have to be critical, this person doesn't do this or is wrong or whatever, which is also cultural, because if I think of my culture, I can say someone, you're mad, and that's wrong, and they won't take offence, but I won't be able to say it in English if I am presenting an argument, or if I want the other person to accept my position, maybe say you're wrong, will create the opposite reaction. But there are ways. I always tell students, you don't need to say, for example, we have been insisting in my opinion, there's this, well, you sometimes don't need to say in my opinion, because by reading the discourse you understand that that's the writer's opinion rather than what somebody else has said. And in my opinion becomes like an unnecessary, and it might create like, why is this person saying in my opinion? Yes, but there are excessive verbs, as I think, that we need to explore with students to signal their position and their stance as writers. Like, for example, it's not the same. Most students would say so-and-so said or so-and-so mentioned, and they use these two words, mentioned and said and wrote and etc., which for me are not saying anything about their stance as writers. And so if you think of argue as opposed to said, or skillfully presented as to said, so they are marking their stance as writers, and they don't need to say whether they agree or disagree with the evidence that they're using to support their argument. But I think that by looking at how the discipline construct these positions and then stances is a way of indirectly showing students how to construct their own stance as writers.
Thank you.
Simon.
I think they're comments. The first one is that I really enjoyed that. I found that very stimulating. Then I suppose coming from a disciplinary background into it, I found myself thinking about power and contestation lots of times. For instance, I was thinking in nursing. Take one probably extreme case of nursing school, but the oldest nursing school in the UK in terms of university is Edinburgh. Located within a social science faculty, and with a very clear, if you look at the homepage, very clear message that we're deliberately a social science department, we're deliberately located within the Scottish tradition of a more generalist approach to humanities and social sciences, and that's what our students get, which clearly is oppositional and consciously oppositional to the mainstream. And equally in midwifery, there are, I think, two very strong traditions there. One, a very clinical tradition, and then the radical midwives tradition, which is much more about ideology, much more about the embodied. So I think one of the interesting things is that kind of tension. Then kind of my last comment linking to that and actually going beyond the undergraduate is, as I was listening to you, I was reflecting on the number of places I'm seeing these kind of debates being played out. That would include, as a journal editor, publishing with a major publishing house that is primarily of science journals. And so when you get from them advice to new authors, the advice to new authors is to write like a scientist. And I get that stuff and I say, well, you know, that doesn't work for our journal. You know, so that's one level. Another that's very prominent in one of my areas of work, which is around development and international development, is you mentioned RCTs, and there's a whole agenda that the randomised control trials, there's a whole agenda of evidence-based practice across a range of disciplines. But what we're currently engaged in a robust discussion with government about is a notion that, essentially the notion of DFID, the British Development Agency, but it's several other agencies, is health research is good, education research is bad. Health researchers can show the impact of a particular intervention. Educational researchers can't, therefore educational research is bad, and therefore if educational research wants any money, it had better learn how to be like health research. We're somewhat contesting this position at the moment, and you know, so we're having a meeting in a couple of weeks' time between the ESSC, DFID and a few journal editors to talk about this. But my third one is the REF process, the Research Excellence Framework, which is what we academics are all being subjected to at the moment. And this tries to talk to some extent about disciplinary effects, but one very interesting thing I'm seeing is I will get papers passed to me from nursing, as an example, and they've been evaluated in that discipline as being at this level on criteria somewhat similar to these, and I'm thinking, well, according to my version of those criteria, they're nothing like that level. But we lack within that process a language of talking about these things, that there is just quality, there is rigour, there is originality, there's significance, and that you should be able to move between disciplines, and that should be totally unproblematic, and of course it isn't.
I remember when we started talking about the different categories for the ref, is, okay, when they say this, what do they mean? Because different people will have different takes on rigour. Okay, what do you mean rigour? Or evidence, as you said. I mean, okay, yes, forms of evidence. Okay, what do we understand by evidence? And that is, there is no generic concept for that, and that's why it's very difficult to move across disciplines without having to struggle or explain yourself what you mean when you say this. And yes, you're right. I mean, when you what you were saying about, you know, different, I mean, publishing houses or publishers saying, well, no, actually, this is, and you look at, you know, the style sheet of certain journals, and they're very, very prescriptive, and this is how you go about writing a scientific article. And it seems that they have created, sometimes it seems to me that they have created style sheets, they have used that style sheets for all the journals. And so I suppose in the passing of time, people will start sort of accommodating those style sheets to reflect the values and identity of the different disciplines.
Have you noticed a difference between the disciplines and the way they view writing as a tool to learning? So perhaps, I don't know, I'm speculating here that maybe in the science fields it's seen more as a way of representing your knowledge, and it's a power thing, whereas perhaps in other disciplines they see it as a process approach, so the students are more involved in the writing as a means to learning their subject. And whether that then does reflect, I mean, going back to perhaps what you were saying as developing criticality, that if students are aware of this, that they see as writing as a means to develop their criticality in their subject area. So I don't know, it's just
I
something.
think there is a tendency within the disciplines, or to my knowledge, of, you know, there is like a trajectory where students at the beginning of their programs are expected to show or display knowledge more than create knowledge. So I usually talk about, you know, knowledge display and knowledge creation that moves towards the end of a program where students are expected to be more critical. And so if you look at what they are writing, their writing is more descriptive at the beginning, but more argumentative, or is expected to be more argumentative as they develop more knowledge and they engage with knowledge more.
I was just wondering, I mean, I'm looking at sort of similar things within my PhD, and I've sort of come to think that actually even the disciplinary level isn't basic enough. And it was a bit like you were saying about nursing being different in different institutions. And if you look at something like education, and you can argue about whether education is a discipline or not, but you know, people will have different epistemological positions even within that. And so for undergraduates, even taking different modules will be expected to write and display knowledge in different ways and to portray evidence in different ways. And it's sort of looking at your last slide is kind of where it has to be, that if it's not almost at a modular level with the person who is teaching the content also taking responsibility for saying this is how I see argumentation within my module.
It's a way of demystifying.
And it kind of it can't even happen at a disciplinary level. It sort of seems to me because you know, even from assignment to assignment, you're requiring people to use a different voice or to kind of portray knowledge
absolutely.
in different ways.
I also feel uncomfortable about saying in this discipline this is what happens, because it seems to give what I'm saying a monolithic nature or sort of feel to it, and it doesn't happen, as you said. There is variation across disciplines, but also within disciplines, and sometimes even within a whole department. And as you said, you look at a full degree and students, and that happens all the time with, for example, referencing systems. We follow Harvard, but then some you know, lecturers within the same program would say, no, for me, you follow APA. And then some people even have different takes on Harvard, because I've sort of come across cases of people who were working in a different university before, and they have their own understanding of Harvard. When they moved to Nottingham, they sort of continue, you know, having the same idea of Harvard, but then other people have a different idea of Harvard. And Harvard is, for example, problematic because there is no manual. You know, stylistic manual like APA. APA has a manual, Harvard style doesn't have. So there are, like, I think 4 or 5 versions, as far as I know, of Harvard, or probably more, and different people call that the Harvard style. And that happens with other you know, attributes like criticality. And as you said, one of the things that I usually work with when I work with colleagues from department is, okay, when you say write an essay, what do you actually mean by essay? Because I've come across cases in which they didn't mean an essay, they meant a report, but they use essay as a shortcut to report. So students who understand an essay as, you know, the way we teach them to write an essay, didn't write a report, they wrote an essay. And they say, no, this is not what I asked. I asked you to write blah, 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 blah. So I think there is, you know, a need to work with both students and sort of demystifying a lot that is happening, even within modules. Yeah. Or critically examining. Okay, what do you mean by critically examining? You know, it's...
Yeah, criticality has become this buzzword,
Yeah.
so you just bang it about.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you ask people, okay, what do you mean by being critical? I'm sure that you would have as many different answers as people you ask, because we have different takes on criticality, which is okay, but that is also telling us that probably generic approaches to criticality are not enough, and we need to probably, you know, locate criticality within the discipline, within the school, within the department, within a module. You know, what Simon was saying, I mean, if I were teaching students who are planning to go to nursing in what university? Edinburgh. Thank you. I would first ask them to read the website and to understand what that proclamation of what they are means, because they are, in a way, they are linguistically constructing their identity. And if they sort of come from, I don't know, university, I used to work for Middlesex University in London, and they move to Edinburgh, they will find that they are studying a completely different thing, because the way they construct their identity is completely different.
But isn't identity actually really crucially what it's about? Because when you're in the process of, as it were, learning to write in a discipline, you're positioning yourself within that discipline. You're learning the way in which that discipline operates, and of course, I mean, part of the battles that take place within disciplines, education has been a particular one, is when people say, no, that's not what I think. You know, if you say to an outsider, this is what work in education is, and they go in there, there'll be people say, no, that's not what it's about. It's like this. This is the way you should be critical in education, not like that. And then that represents a sort of battle of some kind that's going on within the discipline. But I mean, in a sense, it's important. That's one of the things you learn through the process of engagement over time. But it's actually not. I mean, and yes, you can help people a bit by saying, well, there is, you know, this is roughly what criticality means in education, but there are different takes on it and so on. But of course, there's that endless question of how far do you simplify versus how far do you introduce complexity, and at what stage, and so on.
Yeah, and I think, which is connected to what you were saying, I mean, there are certain generic skills that we need to teach students, like reading what that means, like reading that, you know, website, and what are they doing, and what do they mean by saying we are like this. That's nursing. And in education, we do criticality like this. Maybe you can't teach someone, a student, to be critical in terms of, okay, this is what we mean by being critical in education. But you can learn students to interpret what someone is saying when they say, well, no, in education, you are critical this way. And it's a process of learning the tricks of the trade, if you like. Learning on the job, but it could be less painful, I guess. That's what I'm saying.
Just want to say thank you for the presentation, because this is exactly the problem I'm facing. Sorry. I've been trying to answer a social problem for a scientific discipline. So I'm attempting a PhD with combined pharmacy, which is at the very end of the scientific paradigm, very much positivist, and education and development is crazy. And
It's a
When
very difficult
it's very
place to be
difficult.
in. Yeah.
And I come from a background which is completely, I learned in a way which was completely critical. So it took me 3 years to come to a point where I can publish finally a paper in Simon's journal to explain about the problem, the social problem to the science audience. But in the end, I think when I managed to catch a pool of audience from somewhere, I lose the other group of audience. Finally, when the paper was published, nobody from the pharmacy group actually read the paper.
Right. Because it was not written for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were simply too many words for them.
Yeah.
So, it's fantastic presentation, but
Thank you.
so
You know, it happens to me when I start looking at how other disciplines, apart from, you know, outside applied linguistics, write. And I remember the first time I started analysing texts from engineering, and the students were saying, because we use what we call talk around text. So we ask students, once they've written, to explain the text to us. And so I was saying, well, we are being critical because of blah, blah, blah. And I was thinking, that's not being critical, you know. And then I realised, well, no, but I'm an applied linguist, so I'm coming to this engineering text from a different background. So actually, I could understand what you're saying because they were not talking to me, and I wouldn't be interested unless I had to, like in this case, interested in reading their texts, because actually they are not speaking to me, and they mean nothing to me, and they are not critical. And for me, it's just, you know, very descriptive, and if it is descriptive, for me, it's not critical. But for them, it was critical, because what they were doing was critical to the ultimate goal, which was solving a problem.
yeah, but the problem is like you cannot answer a social question using a scientific method. And they are asking for the answer, but they do not want to hear the answer in a social way, for example.
Right. Yeah, I suppose with more interdisciplinary work, then we will come closer together and be able to understand other disciplines and other disciplinary discourses much more. I still look, and this is very personal, I think we have merged a year and a half ago, SEALI, the Centre for English Language Education, with education. And although we share the word education in our names, I'm still trying
even
to...
we in education usually write in the English language, it has to be said.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So there is a lot of overlapping happening, and yet I sometimes don't understand what some of my colleagues are talking about. As I'm sure some of them don't understand why I'm saying what I'm saying, you know, and thinking, what's the fuss about all this? So again, I think, and going back to your point, I think within disciplines and within even the same school and the same departments, you will have variation. That is important for students to be aware of.
Dr. Julio, can I suggest maybe a short workshop from you to postgraduate, because I know many postgraduates are struggling with criticality in writing, and maybe if we can have a short hours, like 1 or 2 hours, you showing, okay, this is how it's done. I'm sure everyone will appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I know. I can show you this is how it's
right,
done.
okay, but at least
I
you
can
know
give
how.
you the tools, probably,
the tools,
or a few tools to discover by yourselves how it is done in your discipline, and probably your own area.
Maybe we can arrange, sometime later.
Suggest it to Roger Murphy.
Sorry?
Suggest it to Roger Murphy.
Right, okay, all right.
As director of PGM.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, one of the issues here, isn't it, is and I frequently come back to this sort of thing in my mind, is how far you can codify stuff that is in one sense tacit knowledge.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously, in a sense, the whole business of academic, of teaching academic writing and so on, is about codifying what, for 50 years ago, people just sort of, you go along, you just kind of, you do a history degree somewhere in that process, you'll learn what it means to be a historian. Well, now we sort of try to codify that and teach it in some way. But then the other thing which always comes to mind is that sort of distinction, which I think it's Dewey, isn't it, that makes between sort of learning as a personal journey, personal exploration, which is inevitably connected with yourself, as against, you know, providing a map of what you have learned afterwards, which you can do, but and it helps other people to some extent, but it isn't their learning, it's your learning that's got to do it.
I think yes, as you say, it's sort of trying to strike the balance, even if it is sometimes a very delicate balancing act to do, is creating the map and for people to decide what kind of journey they're going to embark on based on the map that you're creating. It's like, you know, one of the problems I have with genre theory is that it can become a recipe, kind of saying, okay, you start like this, and then genres are fluid and they change and they're not static. And so what was a research article published in a journal 50 years ago has no resemblance with what is being published today.
But also, but also there's that kind of tricky thing that if you followed the rules perfectly, you'd probably end up with a bad article also, because there'd be that spark of real quality and originality missing from it by people could tell that you follow, you got the cookbook and you'd follow the ingredients.
Well, it's like recipe. I mean, you can ask a recipe for a wonderful meal, but then you cook it yourself and it doesn't work. You know, and you need the other person to come and help you, because I followed the recipe, but I didn't come up with the same goods that you have. But I'm convinced that to be able to flout the rules, you need to know them first. So I'm not saying follow the rules, but at least be aware that actually, you know, in your discipline, for this journal, it's like, you know, writing an article and then deciding what journal you're going to submit it to. That is the wrong end of the stick. I mean, you never do that. You first decide, okay, what journal you're going to write or submit your paper to, and then you start, because there are rules that, you know, we need to know. And then once you become, I mean, I remember the first article I wrote, it was very much a copy of another article that I had, because English was it still is my second language, and so I thought, okay, how do I go about writing a research article? And I sort of started analysing an article that was more or less in the same area, and say, oh, they start with an introduction, but they do this, that, until I became more and more confident about writing my own bit. And if you compare that, I don't know, 12 years ago and what I'm writing now, of course there is a sort of world of difference. But there's always good editors that are prepared to help you and guide you when you're starting.
Yes.
I got a pragmatic question. You know, when I go to a bookshop, there's always some shelves with academic writing, how to write for students, some books. Did you find, to what extent they're helpful? What do you think? You cite one, Cottrell. That's Cottrell book.
I guess the answer is, it depends on who needs to read what. And, you know, taking John's metaphor of the journey, where at the journey the student is. If you are starting...
They divided for humanities and for science students, like separate.
I think there are like generic rules that people need to know, but if they've been doing it for some time, then, you know, that book will not help them. And I would like to see more discipline-specific books on academic writing being written and published. Not only given sort of the rules of the discipline, probably very generic rules again, but, you know, showing the experience of people who are representative in the field and what they've been writing and how they've been doing it, for example.
Sometimes it includes samples of students writing and then analysing their mistakes.
Yeah. Again, it all depends where you're at with your writing, because, you know, a book that shows you mistake other people have made might not be valuable to you because those are not the mistakes that you tend to make, or maybe you don't make mistakes.
Frequently answered questions, isn't it? Which are never the ones you ask.
If Pat Thompson was standing there, she'd be more Argentinian. Being Australian, she'd be more Argentinian about this. Most of these are mad. Most of them are, there's a market niche, but they're actually not,
It's funny, I mean, things are changing because, there is also market reasons why there are very few discipline-specific books on academic writing. They sell less than generic stuff. If you think about Stella Cottrell's book, they are best-selling books because they are very generic and they sort of are used by all undergraduate students. But things are changing. Palgrave is changing their approach to academic writing, and they are publishing more and more in discipline-specific areas. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Well, but before, if we're ending, is there anything else? I've got 2 announcements to make. 2 things coming up. Firstly, the next seminar we've got is on the 23rd of May. Professor Sung Hee Han from South Korea, the Seoul National University in South Korea, is talking on evolution of lifelong learning policies and practices in Korea. And you'd be most welcome to come to that. I hope you all will. And the other thing is that we're collaborating with a unit in the Centre for the Study of Global Justice in the School of something or other, politics, on a workshop on the topic of the public university. And they're inviting, that's on the 15th of June, they're inviting papers anytime up to the 27th of April. So if you want to get an abstract in, a proposal for a paper to that, look at our website now, you'll find it. Not the paper, but how to submit the abstract. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.